The young technician didn't even look up from his clipboard when the old man appeared at the hangar entrance. "Sir, this is a restricted facility. Public tours ended an hour ago." The old man didn't move. His eyes had already passed the technician entirely, fixed on the far end of the hangar where a row of aircraft sat draped in yellow decommission tags. Canvas covers had been pulled back from the nearest one, exposing the cockpit of a CF-104 Starfighter. The kind of aircraft that hadn't flown operationally in decades. The kind of aircraft that, if you knew what you were looking at, still made something in your chest go quiet and serious. "Those," the old man said, "are being broken down." The technician finally looked up. He saw what everyone saw when they looked at August Renner, a man in his mid-70s, slight build, dressed in a plain grey jacket and work pants. A man who might have been lost on his way to a church social. "Scrapped," the technician confirmed, turning back to his clipboard. "Aerospace Museum declined them. We've got new inventory coming in next week and we need the floor space. If you're interested in aviation history, the Diefenbaker Canada Centre does a nice exhibit on." "I flew that airframe," August Renner said quietly. The technician stopped writing. "The one on the left. The serial number ending in 714. I flew her out of Baden-Sollingen in 1971. There was a pause, the kind of pause a young man makes when he is deciding whether to be annoyed or uncomfortable. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to." "I'm not here to cause trouble," August said. "I just want to know where they're going." The technician's name was Cody Verschoyle, 24 years old, 6 months into his position with the National Air Force Museum of Canada in Trenton, Ontario. He had a degree in aerospace systems management and a genuine enthusiasm for his work that had not yet been eroded by the institutional realities of decommissioning decisions made above his pay grade. He looked at the old man. He looked at the aircraft. Something about the steadiness in those pale blue eyes made him hesitate. "Smelting facility in Belleville," Cody said finally, "unless parts can be cannibalized first. Most of the avionics are too outdated to be useful, but there might be some structural components." "When?" "Trucks come Friday." August Renner nodded once. He stood there another moment, looking at the row of aircraft, and Cody Verschoyle had the uncomfortable feeling that he was witnessing something private, something that should not have had an audience. Then the old man turned and walked back out into the grey October morning. If you believe that experience should never be thrown away, comment the word legacy before we continue. August Renner had lived in the same house on the outskirts of Trenton for 11 years. He had chosen it, his neighbours understood, for the same reason he chose most things, without explanation and without complaint. The house was small and well maintained. The driveway was always shoveled before anyone on the street had finished their first coffee. He kept a vegetable garden that produced more than one man could eat, and he left the surplus in a crate at the end of the lane with a handwritten note that said, "Please take what you need." His neighbour, a retired schoolteacher named Lorraine Abbott, had lived next door for 9 of those 11 years and knew August Renner the way you know someone who is genuinely private. Which is to say, not very well at all, and yet somehow completely. She knew he rose before 5 every morning. She knew he walked the same 3-kilometre route along the lake shore, regardless of weather. She knew he was polite in the specific, unhurried way of someone who had long ago stopped performing politeness and simply practiced it. She knew he occasionally drove to Ottawa and returned 2 days later without mentioning where he had been. She knew there was a wooden box on the shelf above his fireplace that he never opened when anyone was visiting. She did not know that August Renner had flown 217 operational sorties during his 26 years with the Royal Canadian Air Force. She did not know that 3 of those missions remained classified under the national security provisions that had never been lifted. She did not know that a general had once told a closed parliamentary committee that Renner's decision-making at 17,000 feet in conditions no manual had anticipated had prevented an international incident that would have reshaped Canadian foreign policy for a generation. She knew that he was quiet. She knew that he was kind. And she knew, in the way that people who have lived long enough begin to recognize the particular posture of it, that August Renner carried something heavy and had chosen, deliberately, to carry it alone. The phone call came 2 days after his visit to the hangar. He had expected it would, eventually. What he had not expected was that it would come from the base commander's office. The voice on the line was brisk and not unfriendly. "Wing Commander Isabelle Chartrand, 42 years old, decorated for her service in the multinational force and observers mission. The kind of officer who had learned early that competence required efficiency and efficiency required directness. "Mr. Renner," she said, "I understand you visited the decommissioning hangar on Tuesday." "I did. I also understand you made a claim about one of the aircraft." "It wasn't a claim," August said. "The serial number is on record. My flight logs are still in the National Archives." There was a pause. Not the uncomfortable kind. The kind that a person makes when they are recalibrating. "Would you be willing to come in?" "Wing Commander," Chartrand asked. "Not officially. Just a conversation." August looked out his kitchen window at the garden. The last of the season's frost had come the night before, and the ground had that particular stillness it takes on when winter has made its first serious announcement. "What time?" he said. Wing Commander Chartrand's office was spare in the way that military offices are spare when they belong to people who are actually busy, rather than people who want to appear busy. One photograph on the wall, her aircraft, her crew, the tarmac of a base August didn't recognize. A citation he didn't look at closely. A desk with 3 active files and a coffee mug that said World's OKS Pilot in faded letters. He liked her immediately. "Sit down, please," she said, and waited until he had before continuing. "I pulled your record this morning." August said nothing. "You flew the CF-104 out of Baden, Solingen and Cold Lake. You transitioned to the CF-18 in 82, flew until 95. 26 years, 100% mission completion rate." She paused. "That's not actually possible, statistically. It's in the record," August said. "I know it is." She set the file down. "Which is why I'm curious why I've never heard your name before." August looked at the photograph on her wall. Not all service is the kind that gets talked about. Chartrand studied him for a moment. Then she picked up a pen, not to write anything, just something to hold. "The aircraft in that hangar," she said. 7 CF-104s. The decision to scrap them was made 3 months ago. Budget allocation, floor space, insurance liability for maintaining non-operational airframes. Standard decommissioning protocol. "I know the protocol," August said. "Then you know there's not much room in it for sentiment." "I'm not here about sentiment." He leaned forward slightly. "Wing Commander, 3 of those aircraft are structurally sound. Not museum pieces. Not sentiment. I mean airworthy pending inspection. The hydraulic systems on the 714 were rebuilt in 1989. The airframe logged fewer than 4,000 hours. You're about to send a functional aircraft to a smelter because no one with the knowledge to assess it properly has walked through that hangar." Chartrand set her pen down. "How do you know the hydraulic systems were rebuilt in 1989? "Because I requisitioned the rebuild myself," August said. "And then I flew her twice more before I was transferred." The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a room changes temperature without anyone touching the thermostat. Word moved through the base the way word always moves through a military facility, sideways, unofficially, and faster than anyone in a position of authority would prefer. By the following afternoon, there were 3 separate conversations in 3 separate parts of the installation about the old civilian who had walked into Wing Commander Chartrand's office and come out 2 hours later with an access badge and a quiet agreement. Cody Verschoyle heard about it from a master corporal in the maintenance division who had heard about it from the warrant officer who had been in the hallway. By the time the story reached Cody, it had acquired a few editorial additions that he chose not to repeat. What he knew for certain was that when he arrived at the decommissioning hangar Thursday morning, August Renner was already there. He was dressed the same as before, grey jacket, work pants, and he was standing beside the CF-104 with the 7 and 14 serial, running his right hand along the leading edge of the wing with the focused attention of a surgeon reviewing imaging before an operation. Cody stood at the entrance to the hangar for a moment before deciding to walk over. "You got clearance," he said. "Wing Commander was kind enough to allow it," August said, not looking up. "To do what, exactly?" August straightened and looked at him. "To look," he said. "For now." Cody watched him work for the next 40 minutes. He didn't plan to stay that long. He had 3 requisition forms due before noon and a site inspection scheduled for the afternoon. But there was something in the way August Renner moved through that hangar that made it difficult to leave. It wasn't nostalgia. Cody had seen nostalgia before, the way older visitors sometimes stood in front of aircraft at museums with a glassy distance in their eyes, somewhere else entirely. This was the opposite of that. August was completely, intensely present. He examined each aircraft the way a physician examines a patient, methodically, attentively, with the particular kind of care that comes from genuinely needing to know. He crouched beneath one fuselage to examine the undercarriage. He asked Cody to bring him the maintenance logs for each aircraft, and when Cody returned with the binders, August read through them standing up, turning pages slowly, occasionally pausing to make a small mark in a notebook he produced from his jacket pocket. "This one," August said eventually, stopping at a second aircraft. "What's the noted reason for decommission?" Cody found the page. Avionics failure. The navigation system threw a fault code in 2019, and the cost assessment for repair came back non-viable. August looked at the aircraft. The navigation system on this model sits in a housing just behind the instrument panel. 3 bolts, 1 connector. The fault code it would have thrown for navigation failure is almost certainly a failed gyroscope unit. He paused. Those units were still being manufactured in 2019. I would want to confirm, but I believe they still are. Cody looked at him. "How do you know that?" "Because," August said, "I spent 11 years flying an aircraft where knowing what could fail and what that failure would cost was the difference between coming home and not." He closed the maintenance log and handed it back. He moved to the third aircraft. By the time he had finished his assessment, it was past 2 in the afternoon. He had identified 4 of the 7 aircraft as candidates for restoration rather than scrapping. His notes filled 6 pages in a handwriting so precise it looked typeset. "You're going to take that to Wing Commander Chartrand," Cody said. It wasn't a question. "Tomorrow morning," August said. Cody looked at the notebook, then at the aircraft, then at the old man in the grey jacket who had come in off the street 2 days ago and now stood in the middle of a military hangar holding 6 pages of technical assessment that no one had asked him to produce. "Why?" Cody asked, not hostilely, genuinely. August looked at him, because someone should. The demonstration was Cody's idea, though he would later wonder whether August had somehow anticipated it. He had spoken to Warrant Officer Dennis Lafleur from the Maintenance Division, partly out of curiosity, and partly because Lafleur had 22 years of experience with fixed-wing aircraft and a low tolerance for what he called theoretical enthusiasm. Lafleur had listened to Cody's account with the expression of a man who has learned that being wrong is more expensive than being skeptical, and then asked to meet the civilian assessor himself. What happened next was not officially sanctioned. It happened in the kind of space that exists in large institutions between the formal approval process and actual human judgment, a space that has always existed and always will, because institutions are made of people and people make decisions the paperwork does not always capture. Lafleur met August in the hangar on a Friday afternoon. He brought 2 younger technicians who positioned themselves with the specific posture of people who expect to be unimpressed. August didn't acknowledge the posture. He simply began. He walked Lafleur through each of his 4 candidate aircraft, explaining his reasoning in the plain, exact language of someone who has spent decades communicating critical information to people who needed to understand it the first time, in conditions where there was no opportunity to repeat it. He pointed to specific components. He named specific tolerances. He referenced specific technical orders by number and described what each one required. Lafleur stopped him twice to ask questions that were designed to probe rather than clarify. August answered both without hesitation, once producing the relevant page number from memory. The younger technicians stopped, assuming they would be unimpressed somewhere around the 20-minute mark. "The 714, Lafleur said finally. "You're saying she's airworthy, pending a formal inspection by a licensed aircraft maintenance engineer," August said, "which I am not. But the documentation supports it, and a preliminary physical assessment supports it. The airframe is sound. The hydraulics were rebuilt. The engine, and I acknowledge the engine is the significant unknown, has not been started in 4 years, but the preservation protocol in the logs appears to have been followed correctly." Lafleur was quiet for a long moment. "You know," he said, "we had an Amy look at 2 of these last year. Brief assessment, budget limitations. She flagged the 714 as potentially viable, but the recommendation didn't go anywhere." August said nothing. He waited. "Politics," Lafleur said. The word carried the particular weight of someone who has watched the right decision lose to the convenient one enough times to have stopped being surprised by it. "The decision hasn't been finalized yet," August said. "No," Lafleur agreed. "It hasn't." Wing Commander Isabelle Chartrand received August Renner's written assessment on a Monday morning. She read it twice before her first meeting. She read it a third time after her last meeting that evening, with the particular attention she gave to documents that required her to think carefully about what she owed to her institutional role versus what she owed to something less easily named. She had pulled his full service record over the weekend, not the summary she'd reviewed earlier, the complete file, the parts that required additional clearance levels and came with a notation that certain portions remained restricted under provisions she could read but not action. She sat with that file for a long time. What she knew was this: August Renner had been one of the most accomplished military pilots in the history of the Royal Canadian Air Force. What the public record showed was a fraction of it. What the restricted sections suggested in the careful language of classification was that the fraction was the smaller part. And he had been living 11 minutes from this base for 11 years, and no one had known. She called him on a Tuesday. "Mr. Renner," she said, "I've reviewed your assessment, and I'd like to know what you'd propose. Practically, not the aircraft evaluation that I can take forward. What would you propose for the aircraft themselves if the decision goes the right way?" There was a pause. When August spoke, there was something in his voice that Chartrand would remember later. Not eagerness, not relief, but a particular steadiness. The tone of someone who has waited long enough to have made peace with any outcome and is now simply speaking plainly about what seems right. "Restoration," he said. "2 of the 4, realistically, with the resources that are likely available. The 714 as the primary. Bring her back to operational display condition. Not flying status, that's not what I'm proposing, but genuine, documented, accurate restoration. Not a shell with a coat of paint. The real thing. And then, training," he said. "The young technicians in that hangar have never worked on an airframe like this. The engineering principles that went into a CF-104 are not obsolete. They are foundational. You learn to maintain a system that was designed with no electronic redundancy, no computer-assisted diagnostics, no automated error correction. You learn what every component actually does. You understand the machine rather than the readout." Chartrand was quiet for a moment. "I'd be willing to lead it," August said. "If that's useful." "It would be," she said. "It would be very useful." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind that exists between two people who have both just understood that a decision has been made and it is the right one, and there is no need to fill it with anything further. The restoration of CF-104 serial full 7-form took 16 months. August Renner arrived at the hangar every weekday morning at 7:30. He brought his own coffee in a battered thermos that had a dent on one side from what he told no one. He wore the same grey jacket until October, when the hangar got cold enough that he added a wool sweater underneath without mentioning it. The work was methodical and slow, and at times confounding. Parts that had been available in the 1980s were no longer available. Systems that had been straightforward to diagnose with the original test equipment required creative reconstruction of diagnostic approaches. There were weeks where progress stalled entirely, where the gap between what had been and what was currently possible seemed to threaten the entire project. August navigated all of it with the same unhurried steadiness. When a problem had no clear solution, he sat with it. He reviewed documentation. He called people, other veterans, retired engineers, former colleagues whose names were not widely known, and had long, specific conversations that Cody Verschoyle sometimes overheard from across the hangar and could not entirely follow. He corresponded with an aviation historian in Edmonton who had spent 30 years documenting the CF-104 program and who, upon receiving August's first letter, wrote back within the day. He taught while he worked. This was not formal instruction. He did not announce lessons or structure curricula. He simply talked through what he was doing as he did it, in a running commentary that was not quite addressed to anyone in particular, but was clearly intended to be heard. Cody, who had begun by hovering out of curiosity, became a regular presence. 2 of the younger technicians, a woman named Priya Nanthakumar and a man named Owen Sauvé, started arriving early on the days August was working. Eventually, it became a kind of unofficial program, not sanctioned, not documented, simply happening, the way the most useful things sometimes do. August remembered their names. He remembered what they had found difficult and what they had understood quickly. He adjusted his explanations accordingly, without drawing attention to the adjustment. One afternoon, Owen made a mistake in a component reinstallation, minor, easily corrected, not the kind of error that would have caused any lasting problem. But Owen caught it himself before August said anything and stopped and looked at it for a long moment. "You see it?" August said. "Yes," Owen said. "Tell me what you see." Owen described the error precisely, including what had caused it and what the correct approach should be. "That's right," August said. He handed Owen the correct tool. "Do it again." Owen did it correctly. He didn't thank August. He didn't need to. Something had passed between them that didn't require a transaction. Cody watched from 3 meters away and thought about the clipboard he'd been holding. The first morning, an old man appeared at the hangar entrance and he'd told him to visit a museum. Wing Commander Chartrand attended the formal commissioning of the restored CF-104 on a Thursday morning in late spring. The weather was the particular blue sky clarity of a Canadian spring morning, when the air still holds some winter in it, but the light has become generous again. The ceremony was small. A handful of officers, the maintenance team, Cody, Priya, Owen, the aviation historian from Edmonton who had driven rather than flown, which August privately found appropriate, a representative from Veterans Affairs, who gave a brief address that was earnest and slightly off-key in the way that official language sometimes is when it reaches towards something it doesn't quite have the vocabulary for. And then Wing Commander Chartrand stepped forward. She spoke plainly, which August respected. She said that the aircraft had been restored not because of budget priorities or institutional recognition, but because someone had walked into a hangar and refused to accept that expertise has a shelf life. She said that the technicians who had worked alongside August Renner in the past 16 months were measurably better. Not just at working on vintage aircraft, but at understanding aircraft, period. She said that the data supported this, and then she set the data aside, because some things are true in ways that data reaches for but doesn't fully hold. She presented August with a shadow box. Inside was the original ID plate from CF-104 Serial 7 Funtorn. Below it, on a simple brass plaque, 4 words: "Service without expiry date." August held the shadow box for a moment. He looked at it the way he looked at most things, steadily, without rush. "Thank you," he said. That was all. Cody Verschoyle, standing at the back of the small gathering, thought he would probably remember this moment for the rest of his career. He wasn't sure he could have explained why, exactly, except that he had spent 16 months watching a man who had every reason to be bitter, overlooked, unrecognized, living quietly in a small house, while decisions were made by people who didn't know what they didn't know, and had watched that man be none of those things. Passionate, precise, generous with knowledge that had cost him enormously to acquire. He thought about the first morning, the clipboard. Public tours ended an hour ago. He thought about what he almost hadn't seen. There is a certain kind of person who does not take up the space they have earned. Not because they have been defeated by the world, but because they have arrived at a relationship with the world that doesn't require it. August Renner was that kind of person. He did not need the commissioning ceremony. He did not need the shadow box or the brass plaque. He had not come to that hangar 2 years ago because he wanted recognition. He had come because he saw something being lost that did not have to be, and he was in a position to say so, and so he did. He drove home that afternoon on the same route he always took, along the lakeshore, with the spring light on the water doing the particular thing it does when a season is fully arriving. He stopped the car once at a pull-out he had stopped at many times before, and got out and stood for a while looking at the lake. He thought about Baden-Sollingen in 1971. He thought about the weight of the aircraft in his hands at altitude, not the physical weight, which was the aircraft's alone, but the other kind, the kind that comes from knowing what a machine can do and choosing, moment by moment, what to ask of it. He thought about Owen Sauvé reinstalling that component. The pause, you see it. There is something that gets passed between people in the places where real work happens that cannot be written into a manual, or uploaded into a system, or optimized for any metric that anyone has yet devised. It lives in the space between one person's hard-won knowledge and another person's genuine willingness to receive it. It is what keeps the best of what humans understand from being lost to time or bureaucracy or the simple failure of attention. August had carried his portion of it for a long time. In 16 months he had passed some of it forward. He stood at the pull-out for another few minutes. The lake was very still. Then he got back in the car and drove home. He rose the next morning at 5, as he always did. He walked his 3-kilometre route along the lakeshore. He tended the garden, which was showing its first green shoots of the season. He left a note in the crate at the end of the lane. "Seedlings available, help yourself," and went inside to put the kettle on. On the shelf above the fireplace, the wooden box sat where it had always sat. Lorraine Abbott, his neighbour, had asked him once what was in it. He had thought about the question for a moment, as he thought about most things. "Records," he had said. She had accepted that, the way you accept answers from someone who has given you a true answer in fewer words than you expected. What was in the box? 11 service commendations, 2 of which bore classifications that prevented their public acknowledgement. 3 flight logs in the precise, dense handwriting of someone who understood that details mattered. 1 photograph of 7 men and 2 aircraft on a runway in a country he had never named to anyone. 1 letter, folded 4 times, from a general he had served under, who had written to him after retirement to say something he had not said during the years when it might have been said officially. The letter had been written on plain paper, not letterhead, that had told August everything he needed to know about what it was worth. He made his tea. He sat by the window. Outside, the lake was doing what it always did, receiving the light, holding it briefly, and sending it somewhere else. August Renner was 76 years old, and he had done what he could with what he knew, and he would continue to do so for as long as he was able. That, he had long since decided, was enough.